Sue Gordon. I'm one of Nick's 3 children, and I'm here today with my husband, Steve. Oh, it's going to be good. And my daughter, Allie. My brother, Chris, and his lovely wife, Linda. Lots of cousins, and a wonderful aunt. My son Benny couldn't be here today. Unfortunately, my sister Kathy is in Scotland, but they're both with us in spirit. And incidentally, from the time we were kids, we always called my father Nick or Nicky. I don't know why, but we always did. And then when he became a grandfather, thanks to me and Steve, he became Grandpa Nicky. A title to be loved. As I look around today, I see that I am in the exact spot where all of his professional, creative, intellectual, and yes, spiritual, even though he never admitted to it, sides all came together in this one place. I don't have to tell any regular concert goer how he reveled in the music, the artists, the place. And he loved introducing it all in his signature red jacket with a giant dog often at his side. But this was the thing, as dedicated as he was to Music Mountain for so many years, the most remarkable thing I think about my father was he had so many other interests. And actually, with each of us kids, he kind of talked to us about different things. To my brother, they would talk about history, they could outquote each other, historical figures, and put it all in the perfect historical context. They would gab on about what was going on at the university club and who did what where, and Nick tried to attend all of those goings on for as long as possible. Linda and Chris also spent a lot of time with him when he made his, unfortunately, more and more frequent visits to his doctors, and they would sit with him or bring him sandwiches or his beloved New York Times. My sister Kathy, who was the one of the 3 of us who really inherited the musical appreciation gene, they would talk about the concerts they'd gone to, talk about different music they listened to, royalty, because she lived in Britain, and she was the only current dog owner of the 3 of us. And my father was the equivalent of non-certified veterinarian. And all you had to do was tell him a few simple symptoms, just quickly, whatever a few symptoms were, and he could diagnose it, and you'd have to call your real doctor for the real vet for the prescription, but he always knew what was going on. He was also an excellent canine nutritionist, and he helped her with her many dogs. To me, I don't know, we would start talking and it would just go, we would be on the phone for an hour talking about all kinds of things. He listened to me when I bragged about my kids or husband occasionally, and we also talked endlessly about home repair and maintenance of houses, of property, of everything. Now, I'm not just saying this because he was my father, but he knew everything, but not in a I'm better than you kind of know-it-all way, but in a fascinating way that often came with wonderful stories. My husband and I spent a lot of time thinking about how to reside our house and what we were going to do and our deck and all kinds of things. Well, it turns out that Nick basically knew the entire history of the North American wood industry. And he knew where and when pressure-treated wood had been discovered, invented, whatever. And someone mentioned the Sears houses. That's when that whole conversation came up about how in the 1930s, all of the Music Mountain houses were built from Sears Roebuck kits. I mean, I sort of knew that, and of course I knew you could order flannel nightgowns or farm equipment, but whole houses, I mean, that was something. My father also had a really wicked sense of humor. And by wicked, I mean he probably should have been arrested. There was a time, we were in Copenhagen one weekend. Wesley, you were there too, I think. And we were in a beautiful square. There was a huge department store that we went into, and we noticed in front of this department store were many strollers that parents had left, and then they would go in and go shopping. The only weird thing was, in the strollers were these beautiful babies that they had also left while they went in to go shopping. So my father had the brilliant idea to make $1 million quick of borrowing these beautiful babies and adopting them out to anybody that wanted this super blonde, gorgeous Danish babies. Well, the more that I gasped at this evil scheme, the more amused he became. And years later, whenever I said, you know, this was not a good idea, he just thought it was his best idea ever. Another time we were at my daughter's college graduation at USC in Los Angeles. When the graduation was over, we were in the middle of the campus. We were in front of this big building with a grand staircase. The entire medical school, she was a film student, the entire medical school was all lined up getting ready to take a group photo. Well, Nick made me go right to the bottom of the steps while he waited nearby off to the side, and he made me say, "Is there a doctor in the house?" And I mean, I have to admit, I wondered if that became part of their graduation story and memory as well. But the thing that Nikki and I really shared was our love of fine cuisine. When the three of us were kids, we went to a few long planned trips to Europe, always planned by going from one Michelin-starred restaurant to the other. And he would always say we had to finish everything on our plates because the chef would commit suicide otherwise. This was years before Michelin-starred chefs actually did commit suicide. I don't know. We also shared a love of ice cream, and I'm sure, oh my God, he loved it so much. And I'm sure that he and Estelle stayed in this certain place in the Ile Saint-Louis in Paris every year, mostly every year, just because it happened to be down the street from this world-famous place called Bertillon, which has the best ice cream in Paris, and my father would have said, the world. One time Steve and I were coming up to visit a long time ago, before he Pritikinized his life and he had a heart attack, you know, all of that, and the incredible discipline that he showed by not eating anything good ever again until he did. But a long time ago, so between the train station and his house, we stopped at 3 ice cream places, just so that we could compare and contrast and see what was better. When I was in high school and an avid cook, he took me to a gravestone quarry where he bought me a beautiful marble slab to roll out pastry, which I still have today. After I came back from cooking school, London, Cordova, he somehow finagled me and a fellow graduate to cater an event for Music Mountain. He didn't pay us, unusual, but he did buy both of us tons of cooking equipment, and including this rolling pin that he insisted on buying me, this wide, this thick across with ball bearings. It was amazing. And that was something Nick strongly believed in, that you had to have the right tools, the right equipment, the right instrument for the task, whether you were in the garden, in the kitchen, in the music hall, wherever. The last food story I'll tell you is one that I told at a family dinner that we had in the fall. When I was in college, Nick had taken me to lunch at this wonderful old classic French restaurant in New York. And they were famous for a 3-tiered dessert cart. So we'd had lunch, whatever. They brought out the dessert cart, and it had tarts, pastries, mousses, everything. And Nick looked the waiter straight in the eye, and he said, "We'll have one of each." They served us without blinking an eye on platter-sized plates, and that was probably my favorite meal with my father. I mean, that was my father. Maybe a tiny bit of a crackpot, but he was also a true original. Unique, classic, rare, excellent in so many areas. I mean, all of that describes him. I could also be talking about a fine meal at Taillevent, his favorite restaurant in Paris, which he would be delighted by. Nicky lived his life to the fullest. He was always curious, he was always learning, and he was always imparting his very own brand of wisdom to anyone who was smart enough or lucky enough to be in his presence. And thank you all for being here to honor my father. Thank you.
I'm Bill Janeway, Nick's first cousin, and now I know what it was like coming on after Nick. Now, one of the things Nick did that I'll never forget is that he organized a memorial concert for my brother, for his my elder brother, his first cousin, and it was extraordinary, in fact. The music was, as you might expect, absolutely spectacular. And I have to say, I want to stipulate, for the benefit of anybody who was at that memorial concert, that Nick never ran over me on his bicycle. But at just about the same time that I was in the penumbra of the emotional shock that resulted when my brother did, I visited, I'm sure this was the first time, I must have been about 8 years old, I visited Nick in the West Village. And I discovered that my cousin lived at the intersection of 4th Street and 10th Street. How cool is that? I mean, how do you manage to shape the universe in such a, and that's of course what Nick did. Now he did have this other life in commerce. He was not only selling Music Mountain and selling the extraordinary art performed here, he spent decades selling time and space for the NBC radio network. And as a consequence, when Mad Men came along, he could identify not just who the real people were behind every face at Sterling Cooper, but exactly what their alcoholic preference and capacity. Nick moved from NBC, and I helped him take ownership, if that's the right word, proprietorship, of a remarkable phenomenon of late mid-century American capitalism called the Keystone Network. The Keystone Broadcasting Network. Now, from NBC, as it was in the golden years of the 50s and 60s, to Keystone Broadcasting in the 70s and 80s it was a step. And I have to tell you, it was not a step up. But what Keystone did across this country, and I still think to an extent it still exists, there were hundreds, thousands of independent radio stations. And Nick would go to the U.S. Army, which wanted to do recruiting advertisements in the parts of the country where, frankly, going to Vietnam was a way out. And Nick would put together 473 radio stations in parts of the country that flyover would be polite in describing them. And he did this from initially New York, and then from this office in Sharon, Connecticut. And it was an incredible way, and it came with a very distinctive style. When you called Nick, when the office was running, and I got to stand away from this right now, the phone would ring once, and then what you'd hear is, Keystone Broadcasting! It was a voice right out of Chicago, where it had originally come from. I think it had been recorded. I'm not sure there was a human being attached to it. But finally, let me say that Nick did have a sort of a secondary spiritual home away from Music Mountain. As Dr. John Truman would attest, it was the Century Association in New York. And you all know Nick as the impresario par excellence. He was also a performer. And every once in a while, the Century puts on an evening of non-professional members' performances, because we've got an awful lot of professionals there, artists and actors. And Nick, the last one that I attended, Nick did a dramatic reading of The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck. No one in that audience will ever forget it. I will not remotely attempt to replicate that performance, but he didn't just have the soul of a salesman. He had undoubtedly the heart of a great performer. Well, the Century has a lot of traditions, and one of them is that the last members' meeting each year is a celebration of all the centurions that we've lost. For many, many, many years, one of the traditions that the pipes be played as a man in full Highland dress gig walks around the hall. Dr. John Truman was our piper for many, many years. And then there's a reading. Very short. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. And now that thou art lying, my dear old carrion guest, a handful of gray ashes long, long ago at rest, still are the pleasant voices, thy nightingales awake. For death he taketh all away, but them he cannot take.